Hello and welcome to the European Parliament for our discussion on some of the biggest issues facing Europe into the future. We'll have this discussion with co-presidents of the left in the European Parliament, Martin Scherdowan from Die Linke Party in Germany and Manon Aubry from France Insoumise in France, obviously. In this conversation, we're seeking to bring citizens and activists into the institutions to talk about how we can achieve real change over the coming years in the institutions and on the streets. Before we take our first contribution from one of those citizens and activists, let's meet the co-presidents. Manon, what is it that the EU should most change into the future?
I would almost answer everything, because if you look at just the way the EU has handled the current crisis, their only belief is the role of the market, and they can think that free competition can save everything. Well, I think we need to turn this the other way around and to remain what the EU should have been created for, which is solidarity. And solidarity meaning solidarity to deal with the social crisis, with the climate crisis, and from there, actually, you know, when I look around me here in the European Parliament, well, I would change almost everything.
Okay, that's pretty clear. Martin, what kind of EU do we want to see as left-wingers develop over the next 20, 30 years, say?
Well, 20 or 30 years should give us enough time to change almost everything, and this is hopefully, this is actually necessary. So if you have a closer look, for instance, at the economic developments of the social situation most of the European Union's citizens are living in, if you have a look at what happens at the borders, if you have a look at what happens with the pandemic and how the crisis is handled, so there is so much at stake, and we need to be very vigilant about every single issue, and this is actually where we should head to a more social, a more ecological, a more just European society.
Okay, thanks to you both. So on to our first video contribution. The last year, of course, has been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we spoke to Hannah, who is a doctor working for Medicines for the People, Health Workers Collective, running a bunch of clinics. We spoke about her work fighting coronavirus.
Hello, I'm Dr. Hannah Bosselaars. I'm a general practitioner working in a medical center of Medics for the People in Molenbeek. We are combining accessible healthcare with local action and national action for the right to health. When we saw this first wave coming, it was very frightening because we didn't have any protocols. Outside of the hospitals, we didn't have any protection material either. And it all went very fast. We went into an emergency lockdown because our system failed to contain the contaminations. And then, during this crisis, when people, the public, started to applaud healthcare workers, we saw that the political lines moved, and there was urgency to give more budget for wages of healthcare workers. So this was an important victory, and it is due to the pandemic and to the raising pressure coming from the field. And we hope to maintain this pressure and show our government and the public that we need publicly funded healthcare with enough staff, because otherwise our system will completely collapse in few time. When I see this protest, when I see how there is more union and more support from the public as well, because healthcare has never been as important as during this crisis. So that's one of our main goals as well with Medics for the People, is to talk to our patients and to make them aware of their right to health. And their right to health is also their right to a good health system. I have a lot of hope that this conscience will raise, and that there will be massive protests, and that our government at some point will be obliged to give more funding. The clash between profits and people becomes so, it's catastrophic. So I think we reached a point of almost no return. We will need to analyze what happened during this crisis and make conclusions and change our system.
Thanks for that, Hannah. So, Martin, how do you think the EU has performed in handling the pandemic?
Well, what Hannah describes here is obviously highlighting the situation that many member states are in, and that many health systems in the member states are in. We are confronted with a logic that has put profits and profitability of health systems over the right to health, as Hannah put it, and I think we completely need to change this logic, because health is a universal good. Health should be a public good, accessible for everybody and everyone, and we have to completely change this. And the same goes here for the way the European Union handled the pandemic. If we talk about the vaccines should be and have to be a public good, and this is unfortunately off the table for now, but we are clearly demanding that everybody has a right to access the vaccine as soon as possible. And if you ask me how the European Union handled the pandemic for now, I can only say that they badly performed. First of all, there is a complete lack of transparency. We have no clue what actually is written in the contracts between the big pharma companies and the European Commission. We have no clue what the member states discuss with the European Commission. And when it comes to distribution, acquisition, and the production of the vaccine, there's also no clarity about it. And this is completely unacceptable, because in the end, this is costing lives in the European Union, costing lives all over the world.
Thanks, Martin. Manon, how is the left trying to shape this debate?
Well, to turn it the other way around, because what really struck me during the whole time of the crisis is that as if the European Commission had no political power. So what we're trying to do is to do politics, because what Martin rightly described is how basically, the big pharma imposed their conditions over the European Commissions. They imposed the opacity of the contracts, that they're still not completely fully public. They imposed their calendar of delivery that they are not even respecting. And now they're imposing that, the patents on the vaccine should not be waived. And at no point the European Commission played its role and say, look, actually, we're the one making the rules. And I had the impression the big pharma were making the rules. And wait, are we supposed to be elected to do this? And it's because literally the European Commission accepted to let the big pharma make those rules. And that's why I believe, okay, if we were to make the rules, there are tons of things we can do, starting with waiving the patent. Because if we want to exit from that crisis, we need sufficient vaccines for everyone. And to be able to provide sufficient vaccines for everyone, well, we need to increase our production capacities, and they are not all used across the world. 47% of the production capacities of vaccines are not used, and they are not used because they're big pharma that want to make profit over the pandemic. And we're seeing clearly with Pfizer, for example, they're making 30% margin over the sale of their vaccines. And just thinking wait, what is more important, their profits or the health of millions of people? So that's why one of the big fights of our group and the left over the last couple of months has been to waive the patents. And just to conclude on this, we're not the only ones to call it. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is calling for it. More than 100 states, a lot of scientifics, a lot of non-profit organizations. So we're trying to bring their voices here, which I believe is the role of our group.
Okay. All right, thanks, Manon. So while the pandemic has tested governments and health systems over the past year, it has also been used as an excuse to crack down on fundamental rights in certain countries. We've a contribution now from a Polish activist, Florentina Gust, who explains a bit more about what's happening in her country.
This year was difficult and tough for all of the people around the world. But anyway, I think the situation in Poland was quite different, because it was not only a healthcare crisis and pandemic crisis we struggle all around the world, but as well human rights crisis. Because Polish government used the pandemic to violate human rights once again. First, last summer, when they attacked and detained LGBTQ people who protesting and fighting for their rights in the streets. And then right after, when they made one of the most strict European abortion law even stricter. But something happened, something that brings hopes to us, and these are this mass protests led mostly by the young people, by teenagers. And this is something that right fundamentalists, not only in Poland but everywhere in Europe, should be scared about. And this is something we, as the left, should remember. That this young generation, not only most progressive, is also the most affected by the pathologies of capitalism. The access to public housing, the safety and stable workplace is the problem which affects the mostly the young people. And from the left to the young people should be a clear message that they will never go alone, that there is always a force who remembers about it in European Parliament or in our local governments, and this force is of course the left. Greetings from Poland.
Thanks, Florentina. Well, Florentina speaks about the role of youth in achieving change, and young people have really led the fight against the climate crisis in the last few years. Manon, you've walked many a street with climate protesters in France and internationally. How can we contribute more to that movement and help build on its successes?
Well, change the system, not the climate. It's one of their leitmotiv in the streets, and I think this needs to be heard here. And there's this belief in the European institution that you can put like a few patch, over a system, and then this will work out. And that we don't need to systematically change. But I do think if you want to take the climate seriously, you need to change it all, starting with your objective to reduce gas emission. If we want to be serious about the Paris Agreement, it has to be reduced by 65%. That's what our group is fighting for here in the Parliament. Well, the Council just agreed on a very low target of 55%, which in practice is even 52% because there's a calculation trick, but I'm not going to go into the details there. So first is to set an ambitious objective. And second, well, is to have consistent policies that go with them. And you can't want to reduce your emissions if at the same time you continue with free trade agreements, you continue with an agricultural policy that keeps this agro-industrial model that has a lot of impact. If you keep subsidies for fossil fuels, that's what the EU is doing, and that's what we're trying to break from, to really have an ambitious Green New Deal that is both social and environmental, that can create millions of jobs in agriculture, in renewable energies, etc. And that's the deal we're putting on the table.
Okay. Thanks, Manon. Well, the fight for climate justice is linked to many other battles and movements around Europe, especially the trade union and workers' movement. And we have a contribution now from Ana Pires, who is on the National Committee of the CGTP, which is the largest trade union federation in Portugal. Ana.
The pandemic has greatly exacerbated a number of major structural problems for workers and their families. The employers taking advantages of the epidemic and the insufficient and unbalanced government measures have aggravated workers' situation and also the impact of the existing problems, such as low wages, precariousness and easy dismissals, the work time deregulation, the collective bargaining blockages, and the labour law unprotective of workers, just to name a few of them. The workers' struggle has been fundamental to halt attempts of increased exploitation and to address the workers' and families' problems. Struggles that occurred at the workplaces and on the streets, carried by public and private sector workers, ensuring that government support measures are strengthened. Moreover, these struggles prevent the violation of rights, freedoms and guarantees that are put into question, while some are trying to convince us that we are all in the same boat. We can't accept that the right to safe employment continues under attack through multiple forms of precariousness. We cannot accept that workers impoverish every day. We cannot accept to have our future tied up, nor continuing to see the inequalities rising further. The workers' organized struggle, their unionization and organization in trade unions that defend their rights and fair claims has been the right way to change the correlation of forces. Work and labour valuation is the key for improving the living conditions of workers and the people and for the much-needed economic development. The workers' struggle is indispensable and, without a doubt, is going to continue.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Martin, Anna says the economic crisis, the pandemic and the economic crisis that it produced has exacerbated inequalities over the last year. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and unfortunately I have to say that I absolutely agree with this assessment from Anna, and I want to send my best regards to her in Portugal, but to all the trade unionists fighting all over Europe for better living and working conditions. And I just want to assure them, and Anna especially in this case, that our fight is that the fight that we lead here in the European Parliament is also your fight, and your fight is our fight. The economic situation, the social situation is actually comparable to a situation of free fall in many sectors, and precariousness rises. Anna described the situation very well, and we are at a crossroads now. And we have to decide whether we want to continue with politics that impose austerity in the European Union, which will only increase precariousness, or if we come to a change of politics, a complete change, meaning that we invest into the future, meaning that we invest into the ecological transition and the digital transition, that we invest in our social security systems, that we invest in our health systems. And this is what is needed for now. And this, of course, this complete change of politics at the European level has to be linked closely to collective bargaining, to strengthening trade unions all over the European Union. And there's only one example I want to give, and then I will come to an end. We have witnessed cases where companies like Amazon are engaged in union busting in Poland, for instance. And this is completely unacceptable. This is completely unacceptable. So it has to be not only a question of a change when it comes to the economic recovery, but also this economic recovery has to be closely linked to better and improved social and working conditions.
Okay, thanks, Martin.
Welcome.
Mano, what is something the EU could do to put the economy at the service of people?
Well, is to make sure that it serves the majority of people. Because my fear is that there's been a lot of, nice speeches that after the crisis, it's not going to be the same anymore. We've all heard this, either here from the EU institution or from, some political leaders nationally, etc. But the first thing that they do, it's exactly the same than before the crisis. Martin was talking about austerity measures. Do you think that they will, change for good that stupid rule of 3% deficit that is asking states to reduce their expenses? Well, in a hospital, for example, and we've seen the impact and the consequences of this over the last couple of months. Well, actually, no. And we have a recovery plan at the European level, but this plan is tied to reforms. But those reforms are the same neoliberal reforms that are asking states to save money and to save money on people. So that's one thing. And the second thing is about how you can collect money. And actually, it was not the crisis for everyone. There are some people that got richer. Some companies like Amazon, Netflix and others that made profits. Well, I think we need to tax them. And we're in exceptional circumstances. And in the past, during wars, for example, some states introduced some exceptional taxes on the richest and on multinationals that made profit. And I think that should be the priority for now. And that's maybe why I'm wearing also that shirt. Because it shouldn't be, to workers that already suffered so much from the crisis. It shouldn't be them paying the crisis now.
Okay, thanks, Manon. And a nice T-shirt, of course.
Thanks.
Very clear message. So, as we've heard, without proper protections for workers and workers' rights, the future of Europe will be marked by even more inequality. While that's going on, of course, we're seeing billions of euros being wasted on massive projects of militarization over the recent years. So we spoke to Sarah Reeder. She works for an NGO called Agir pour la Paix, Peace NGO, and we tried to get her views on Europe's arms industry. Let's hear what she has to say.
Hundreds and thousands of people have been killed by the EU's militarised border regime and in conflicts fuelled by European arms exports and support to countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel and Mexico. Add this to the death and destruction caused by the promotion of an industrial model of agriculture, a fossil fuel and extractivist-based economy, and the negotiation of new free trade agreements, the EU has blood on its hands. This all builds on centuries of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, exploitation and conflict. The increasing militarisation of the European Union and its borders cannot be separated from the corporate interests that have been influencing and benefiting from it. The European Defence Fund will be an €8 billion fund for military research and development for 2021 to 2027. The creation of this fund was heavily influenced by the arms industry lobby and the very companies who are going to be benefiting from these multi-billion euro subsidies. €5.6 billion has been reserved for Frontex, a key actor in the militarisation of Europe's borders and human rights violations. The agency can now own equipment and is recruiting an army of border guards who can own and use handguns. All this benefiting, again, the same arms security and surveillance companies who have been involved in lobbying to shape the EU's border and migration policies. There is a growth cycle where the same arms companies like Thales, Leonardo and Airbus are not only fueling conflicts and repression that cause people to leave, but then benefiting from the militarisation of Europe's borders. So what is the left doing to stop the militarisation of Europe, to end the arms industry lobby, to end European arms exports to countries like Saudi Arabia, and to abolish Frontex and the system it represents?
Okay, thank you for your contribution, Sarah. Before getting a reaction on Sarah's statements and questions, I wanted to show you another clip. This comes from someone we spoke to who has direct experience of some of the border violence that Sarah mentions in her video. Hamza is a refugee who fled Iraq towards Europe's borders on a very dangerous and life-threatening journey towards Europe. Let's hear his story.
يعني احنا فكرنا نطلع من العراق لاوروبا، احنا ندري اوروبا انسانيه. انا جاي اطلب الانسانيه، من اطلب المساعده. يعني انت من شوف كرواتيا هي من ضمن الاتحاد الاوروبي. تقول انا هاي الاتحاد الاوروبي هسه عذبوني. يعني العالم انتهت بالبوسنه وبالكرواتيا. لا اكو قوانين. البوليس الكرواتي يعامل البشر كانسان، يعني عوفك انت مسيحي مسلم يهودي، عاملني كبشر، انا بشر وانت بشر، عاملني كبشر.
Okay, and thanks to Hamza for that. Martin, I have two questions for you then after those two videos. What is going on at Europe's borders, and what needs to change here in the EU to make sure that kind of violence ends? And also, to follow on from Sarah's question, what can we do to tackle EU militarization?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Hamza for sharing his story with us. This is actually very touching to see somebody stating witness to what happens at the external borders in Europe and who suffered from border violence. And this is completely unacceptable. Our group commissioned this black book of pushbacks, and what is clear is that Hamza might have a unique fate, but he is unfortunately not the only one who suffers this fate. And this book the Black Book of Pushbacks that we commissioned as a group bears testimony to hundreds of people who suffered from border violence. And obviously there is something really wrong at the borders because the European Union doesn't aim to follow international law here, and it is in complete breach of international law. The Geneva Convention, the Human Rights Convention clearly state that everybody who flees from a war-torn country has the right to individual asylum, also in the European Union. And I wonder what happened to the so-called European values, whether European politics do not follow this approach to actually guarantee the rights of individual asylum to those. On the contrary, the European Commission put forward a proposal for a so-called migration pact, and we can only describe this pact as a pact of shame because they are really aiming at expulsing people from the European Union, not allowing them to enter the European Union. They are aiming at getting into deals with Erdogan and other militia warlords and authoritarian leaders and presidents. So this is completely unacceptable, and we are aiming at a migration politics that is based on human rights and guarantees the individual right to asylum. And when it comes to the question that Sarah raised, well, our group, namely a former member of our group, Sabine Lösing, and me, we commissioned a report. We were asking a constitutional lawyer to assess the European Defence Fund. And he found out that it's clearly in breach with European law. Article 41 of the Treaty of the European Union does not allow, or actually prohibits, the use of public money and public money for military purposes. And this is a clear breach of Article 41, and that's why we will take this to the European Court of Justice in order to try to stop the militarization, the ongoing militarization, and the use of public means or funds for this purpose of militarization. And yeah, let's see what the outcome will be. But we are doing our best, not only politically, but in the meantime also with legal means.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Martin. So when discussing EU policies on migration and militarization, we're touching upon issues of fundamental rights, of course, but also on the power of lobbies, for instance, in shaping EU policymaking. I'd like to show you a contribution now from EDRI, which is a digital rights network of NGOs who defend digital rights. That will give us their view on why they think defending these rights is to defend human rights, that it's the same battle. So Andrea Bellu is going to explain it a little bit more. She works for EDRI here in Brussels. Andrea.
Technological development can work for people. Just look at free and open source software or decentralized platforms. However, in the past decades, private or political powerful actors have used technology to cement their power position, using public infrastructures and public money to develop technologies that erode people's power. We saw attacks on our fundamental rights and freedoms, on our privacy, on our freedom of assembly and expression, on our right to self-determination, to anonymity, and to a life free from discrimination. New technologies, such as artificial intelligence, can exacerbate existing capitalist, anti-unionist, patriarchal, and discriminatory power structures. Mass surveillance, such as facial recognition in our public spaces, risks creating societies of suspicion and turning us all into potential suspects. Political attacks on encryption risk the confidentiality of communication, essential for all of us, and especially for journalists or human rights defenders. Private, centralized platforms shape democracies and societies. They erode our workers' rights and police our speech and silence historically silenced voices. This is not science fiction, it is happening. Amazon's campaign against its workers, or Uber's documented practices in Italy against also its workers, biometric mass surveillance evidenced in Italy, Spain, Greece, Germany, France. They're all speaking this truth. We must unite across borders and across movements. In regards to AI, you can become an ally. Ensure EU's AI legal framework protects first and foremost people's rights against the most harmful uses, and that it draws red lines on practices such as predictive policing or other discriminatory AI. You can support a rights-based approach that allows beneficial uses of AI to flourish, and you can mobilize people for a ban on biometric mass surveillance across EU. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, for that contribution. Martin, how powerful is big tech in Brussels or in other European capitals?
Well, not too powerful. I would say they control maybe 70 or 80% of the complete digital market, of the overall digital market. And there has not been a single merger that has been prohibited or stopped by the competent authorities. Not the European authorities, not the national authorities. Meaning that the Big Five or the GAFAM were engaged in more than 700 mergers and not a single one has been stopped. So you can only imagine how big actually their political and economic power became in the meantime. And of course they are not interested in the regulation of the digital market. But this is something that is needed, that EDRI, also by the way an NGO that we are closely collaborating with, is always pointing out, as the spokesperson just did. And the key question for us is on how to fight big tech's power. And we can only rein in on their not only structural power, but we also have to rein in on their business models. And this has just been presented. We are living in kind of an age of surveillance capitalism. They are collecting our data. They are using our behavior as the mine, so to say, as the resource, as the data is the resource, and they are somehow combining the data, and then they are targeting us in our behavioral, let's say, predictable, whatsoever we are doing in the future. They are aiming at selling goods to us. They are aiming at influencing also our democratic behavior, and we already witnessed this with Cambridge Analytica and their interference in one of the US elections when Trump won, luckily so only, or fortunately so only once, and when they were also interfering in the Brexit referendum. So this is what we really have to be aware of. This is not only a question of economic power and political power, it's also the way they are conducting their business model, which really creates a new type of society in the end, an anti-democratic society, because they can only be successful with collecting data if they have the totality of data, which means this is in itself an anti-democratic approach, an anti-democratic economic model. And so that's why we have to also fight their business model.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Martin. And you mentioned, sorry, the big five tech companies. That's Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple,
and Microsoft.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Just to explain for anyone who doesn't know. Thanks for that. Yeah. Manon, what's your experience of this kind of power of big tech?
Yeah, I think what Martin said is really true, to understand that it's a democratic issue, because they are taking power over our life, but they're also taking power over politics. And we see it every day, where the role of lobby, is very important, very prominent in shaping the rules at the European level. Meaning that the power of those lobbies is often, if not always, much bigger than the power of us as direct representatives of people. And I have countless stories of influence from those lobbies. The most recent one, just last week, the French Business Association literally wrote from the first sentence to the last sentence, the position of France for the negotiation of a very important file on tax transparency. And the reason why, it's obviously because the large companies, they don't want to say where they pay the taxes, because they're not paying their fair share of taxes. And the reason why the EU is so weak on tackling tax dodging, the reason why there's still tax havens inside the European Union, like Ireland, like the Netherlands and others, well, it's actually because there are those big companies that have way too big influence over policies here, and because those lobbies are way too influential, that's why we also need people to take over the power here together with us, to break those walls and to bring back people, and not to have lobbies all around.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Manon. So I think a theme that seems to be emerging here is that all these battles, all these struggles are linked. They're interconnected in many different ways. Digitalization, of course, risks the exacerbation of inequalities, as we've just heard. And poor people are hit by digitalization in different ways to others. People of color, women, we're all affected by this in different ways. So let's turn our attention then to a major factor in inequality in our societies, which is gender. And we have a contribution now from Roberta. She's an Italian feminist activist, and she's going to talk to us about why the EU needs to be feminist and what the EU can learn from the feminist movement. Roberta.
My name is Roberta. I'm a feminist, activist, and member of the editorial board DWF, a historical Italian feminist magazine. Why does the European Union need feminisms? Feminisms create culture both from the top down and the bottom up. This means that feminist movements are the only way at the moment to shape policy, remain rooted, taking to the streets to defend women's rights, while also becoming theory, policy, responding to emergencies, and transforming them into new directions. The great project of United Europe, aiming to keep the differences together without flattening them out on a universal standard, got crushed from a form of financial governance and a system put together with the restrictive rules, erected walls, or even worse, standing as a fortress. Data on gender inequality, gender-based violence, and discrimination are alarming. All of us feel the urgency of fighting the authoritarian democracy. Here are 3 feminist points the EU should take up. Women have never constructed their political identity on nationalistic basis, most probably because their cause is rooted in the fight against patriarchal universalism. A European citizenship must bring the focus back to welfare, well-being, solidarity, and guarantee civil rights to all. Europe embraces a multiplicity of cultures, and so it is one of those places where citizenship is destined to become a matter of physical human beings inhabiting a certain territory and not of passports. Time is up. Secondly, the women's European experience has proved highly beneficial in terms of lifelong learning about other women's practices and comparing them with their own. Free and high-quality access to education and training remains a key battlefield for many of us. Thirdly, being center and being margin. Being European is much more perceived in big cities than in small towns or villages. How to bring the people in the EU together? The EU must work hardly to create opportunities in the peripheric areas, in the margins. The outbreak of the pandemic and the digital transition could bring more and more people to live in rural areas, so that it's becoming urgent to reach all the territories, not only in the European cities. Being feminist is a matter of social justice for all. Lessening of demands is not a real solution.
Thanks for that, Roberta. Manon, what makes the left different on this issue of feminism from the mainstream or from the right?
Well, first off, to bring women's voice here in the Parliament, because I'm sitting, for example, in the Economic Affairs Committee, and there are only 10 women out of 70 people sitting in the committee. But most importantly is what do we say? Because it's the same as with climate for me. You can pretend to be, environmental friendly person, or you can pretend to be a feminist. But if you don't change the system, if you don't challenge the patriarchy, well, actually, you would just have something, at the surface. But you won't change the root causes of inequalities between men and women. So, of course, it's about, pure women's rights, like the right of abortion. When I see that in Poland, it's criminalized. I'm worried about, is that the EU that we want for women? But it's also about bringing, that gender vision into everything that we're doing. To fight for public services, to fight for a decent minimum salary. This is a feminist perspective, because women are the ones, we have the lowest salaries, because women need to have public services to actually, not just to be at home and taking care of children. So it's about, from everything that we're doing, having that feminist perspective and always challenge the sort of patriarchy that has been imposed to us and in which we grew up somehow. So it's really about shaking it. And sometimes it takes a little bit of courage, especially when you hear, some of these very sexist comments like we sometimes hear here in the Parliament, including here.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Manon. So, we've been talking about the key fights facing the future of Europe here, but there's no future, of course, without historical memory, especially at a time when the far right is on the rise across Europe and threatening fundamental rights in most cases. Recently, our former MEP and leader of the Podemos party in Spain received this in the post. It's a letter, an envelope containing 4 bullets and a death threat. The bullets were aimed at each one member of his family. Martin, what do you make of this, and what can we do to tackle the increase in the far-right narrative across Europe?
Well, me personally, I grew up in an anti-fascist family. My grandfather has been imprisoned in the concentration camps of the fascists. So this is what I've been raised with, a value, self-understanding to be anti-fascist. And this is not only a political task that stems from the past, it is actually something that we have to face, unfortunately, in our day-to-day politics in the meantime, because, as you righteously so put it, David, we see the rise of extreme right-wing parties all over Europe, and those death threats that Pablo Iglesias received, they are not tolerable. This is completely unacceptable, and this is unfortunately not only him facing these death threats. Also, my party, one of my party leaders, was receiving similar death threats, etc. So this is a phenomenon that we have to deal with. But I received with huge relief the news that the Parliament, and our group as well, voted for it in favor, lifted the immunity of this Greek neo-Nazi. And he's been a member of a terrorist organization, the Golden Dawn, and has been obviously personally been involved in the murder of Pavlos Fyssas, a Greek musician and Greek rapper. And I used to work a lot in Athens, and I financed a project there with the foundation I used to work for called the Golden Dawn Watch. And we were closely following the whole trial against Golden Dawn, and we were already aware of the involvement of Pavlos, not of Pavlos Fyssas, but of the fascist here, who then has been a member of the European Parliament until recently. And what we have to do is to counter their narrative on the one hand of an exclusive, white, racist, sexist society with our narrative of an open, inclusive society based on equal rights for everybody. And this is the strongest political tool that we have at hand. And we have to not only tell that narrative, but we also have to live it. And we have to show that we are better than they are, and I can only say we stopped them once and we will stop them again.
Indeed, absolutely. Thanks, Martin. Manon, following up on that, as you know, as left-wingers, as feminists, as a group that defends fundamental rights, what does it mean to be an anti-fascist in the European Parliament, an elected member of the European Parliament who is anti-fascist?
Well, first is a bit like you've done in Greece, to be sort of whistleblowers of what they're standing for. Because here we're voting a lot of things. We have, you know, thousands of votes every plenary session, and no one knows who they really are and how dangerous they are. Every single day here, they're tabling amendments against fundamental rights of women, against abortion. They're tabling amendments to challenge our democracy, to challenge our republic. They're racist, but also from an economic perspective, they're actually, you know, on the side of austerity. We have to say here that, you know, they are in favor of conditionalities as well. They're in favor of cuts in public services. So we have to tell the truth about who they are. And then, well, we have to you know, not to be afraid, because some, including sometimes some people who are claiming themselves as being from the left family, they're hiding. They're hiding, and they let them so much space that at the end they're taking it. And the far right, and I'm very serious when I say this, the far right is close to take over a lot of EU countries. This is true in Spain, this is true in France, this is true, it has been the case in Italy. It's true already in a few Eastern countries. And so what's the next step? You know, and we should learn from history and not to repeat the same mistakes. And all of those who are not taking seriously those threats, they're going to pay a very high price of it. And that's why, and I'm calling also, you know, all of the rest of the left, we need, you know, the Greens, the Socialists, etc. We need a strong answer to protect our fundamental freedoms that all of the generations before us have been fighting so hard for, and now they're very endangered.
Okay. All right, thanks for that, Manon. So we're almost at the end of our time. Thanks so much so far, Manon and Martin, for your contributions to this, and of course, thanks to the participants. Just before you go, we'd like to give you 30 seconds for a final message in your own language. En français und auf Deutsch. Who'd like to go first? Martin?
Das hat mir sehr gefallen. Vielen Dank, David. Vielen Dank für die Beiträge der Verbündeten, unserer gesellschaftlichen Partnerinnen und Partner. Ich möchte euch alle einladen, ich möchte Sie alle einladen, gemeinsam mit uns Politik zu gestalten hier im Europäischen Parlament. Wir brauchen eure Anregungen. Die linke Gruppe hier, die linke Fraktion hier im Europäischen Parlament ist der Ort, an dem progressive Politik entwickelt wird, an dem aber auch progressive Politiken in die Praxis umgesetzt wird und wo wir eng zusammenarbeiten mit all denen, die das auch gesellschaftlich verfolgen.
Danke, Martin. Manon, s'il vous plaît.
I'm still in the process of learning German.
Did you get anything?
I got some. That's the beauty as well of working all together in so many different languages. But I'll get back to French because it's important also to defend all of the languages, including French in the institution. Et un mot en français peut-être pour se mettre dans le contexte de la relation de la France aussi à l'Union européenne. Moi, je fais partie de cette génération qui a grandi en France à la suite du référendum sur le traité constitutionnel européen en 2005, où le non l'a emporté à plus de 55%, assez largement. Voilà, j'avais 15 ans à l'époque. Et la question qui nous était posée, c'était quelle Union européenne on voulait. Bon, les gouvernements ensuite en France se sont littéralement assis sur le vote des Français, mais comme d'autres gouvernements aussi dans le reste de l'Union européenne. D'où l'importance pour nous de ramener cette petite voix, cette voix qu'ils ont voulu faire taire pendant des années ici dans les institutions européennes. Et nous voulons dire très clairement que la gauche ramènera cette voix, qu'ils le veulent ou non, au Parlement européen, qui est la voix des travailleurs, qui est la voix des jeunes pour le climat, qui est la voix de ceux qui se battent dans les syndicats, qui est la voix du monde associatif d'où je viens, et que ces voix-là, qui ont été trop longtemps tues dans les institutions, eh bien, on essaiera de continuer à la porter aussi haut et aussi fort qu'il le faut, parce que je crois que sinon l'Union européenne se coupera définitivement des cititoyens avec toutes les conséquences que l'on peut imaginer.
Okay. Thanks, Manon. Thanks for that. Danke and merci. The other way around, maybe.
Exactly.
Our appreciation, of course, goes to all the participants for their contributions. Thanks to them, to the technicians here in the European Parliament, and especially to you for watching. Keep letting us know what you think are the key issues facing the future of Europe by commenting below this video. And thanks, of course, to our co-presidents.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.